After Sunday dinner, my mother stood up abruptly, pointed straight at my face, and shouted, "Get out of this house and never come back." And this time, I did. Welcome to Family Ashes, where family secrets can never stay hidden forever. If one day, the very person who gave you life threw you out of the house right after you had quietly paid nearly $80,000 to keep that roof from collapsing, what would you do? Hit subscribe, like the video, share it, and tell me your story in the comments. My name is Lauren Mitchell, I'm 32 years old, and I work as a financial advisor in Charlotte, North Carolina. On paper it sounds steady and secure, but my family has never been a place where I could find safety. My mother, Caroline, is the kind of woman who wants to control everything, how I dress, how I speak, even how I breathe, and she never misses an opportunity to criticize. My father, Edward, is gentle, a man who avoids conflict at all costs, slipping quietly out of the room whenever the air in the house thickened. I have an older brother, Mark, now 37, living in Texas and rarely coming back, and an older sister, Rachel, 35, settled in Chicago. Both of them escaped the family storm long ago. That left only me, the youngest, stuck for years inside a 5-bedroom house in suburban Charlotte, the house with its trimmed lawn and polished living room, the very thing my mother held up as the ultimate symbol of her success, though in truth it was nothing more than a shackle keeping us all bound together. I grew up in a home where comparison was the rhythm of daily life, so constant it became haunting. Mark was always the naturally brilliant one, Rachel was the shining example, and I, it seemed, was born only to embody disappointment. Report cards that should have been my pride never counted for much. I could bring home straight A's with one lone B in the corner, and my mother's cold finger would land on that single letter as she asked, "Why couldn't you be more like Rachel?" She never got less than an A+. Every accomplishment of mine was stopped at the doorway by a raised eyebrow or a dismissive comment that blurred out all the effort behind it. My friends weren't spared either. I remember the very first evening Olivia came over when we were 14. The moment she left, my mother sighed, "That girl seems shallow. I don't like the way she dresses." That sentence carved itself into my memory, and from then on every friendship felt like a gamble. What would she criticize this time? Even my own body wasn't safe. The jeans I loved were said to make me look heavier than I really was, my haircut was unflattering, and even the way I laughed was brushed aside with a shake of her head. The breaking point came when I dared to voice my dream. I wanted to study economics, to become someone who could read the language of numbers and use them to sketch the outlines of the future. I believed I could find freedom in charts and balance sheets, a freedom I had never known in my own home. But my mother immediately scoffed, her voice sharp as a blade, "Women aren't taken seriously in finance. Be realistic. Study nursing, it's at least a secure profession." Her words poured into my ears like a sentence being passed down, but for the first time I didn't bow my head in defeat. I knew I didn't want to live a life mapped out by her, a life designed only to give her more reasons to keep control. I chose finance, not to prove her wrong, but because I needed to protect the small part of me that she hadn't managed to crush. After graduating from the University of Michigan, I returned to Charlotte with the finance degree my mother had once mocked as useless. I started at the very bottom in a well-known investment firm in the city, and those first months felt like a constant test of my endurance. I worked so late the building's security guard began calling me by name. I lived on black coffee and thick stacks of reports. But I climbed, step by step, and by the age of 28 I had become one of the most sought-after investment advisors in the office. I still remember one client, a businessman in his 60s, shaking my hand firmly and saying, "You made me believe in numbers again." At the firm, I was the person they relied on, the name brought up in important meetings, the colleague others came to for guidance. I was valued there, I had carved out a place with nothing but my own sweat and persistence. Yet the moment I stepped back into my parents' house, all of it dissolved into nothing. My mother never asked what major deals I had closed, which clients I was trusted to advise, or what milestones I had reached. Instead, she introduced me with that same flat, dismissive tone, "She works with money." Short, hollow, as if my entire career were nothing more than some odd hobby not worth explaining. I remember vividly the day she said it right in front of a neighbor, while I was still glowing with the news of a promotion. I forced a smile, but inside I felt as though a bucket of cold water had been poured over me. The bitterest part wasn't that she failed to understand my work, it was that she deliberately diminished it, the way she always had since I was a child. No matter how far I went, in her eyes I was still the daughter who would never be enough, always lacking, always falling short. And that calculated indifference, wrapped in the politeness she wielded so well, carved a deeper distance between us with every passing year. At the office I was respected, but at home I was nothing more than a shadow of myself, trapped in her silence and her cool disdain. When my father lost his job at 59, it wasn't just a financial blow, it was a fracture through the core of our family. He had given nearly 30 years of his life to a medical supply company, never taking more than a few sick days, never uttering a single complaint. And yet with a 15-minute meeting labeled restructuring, he came home carrying a white envelope in his hand and a weight on his shoulders as if the ground beneath him had given way. I watched him sit for hours in the old armchair, his eyes fixed on the television screen but not really seeing, the light flickering across a face that had gone completely blank. The severance package covered a few months, but my mother carried on as though nothing had changed. She refused to cut expenses, refused to cancel the weekend cocktail parties, still ordered fresh flowers for the living room every day, still replaced curtains and bought new dinnerware sets because people will notice. When my father suggested selling the brand new SUV to ease the pressure, she dismissed him with a sharp wave of her hand. We are not those kinds of people. At my age, who would hire me anyway? I will not lower myself like that. Her words landed like both a declaration and a threat, making it clear to everyone in the house that tightening belts did not exist in her vocabulary. The truth didn't need to be spoken aloud, it revealed itself in small, undeniable details. I noticed the thick envelope stamped in red with the word overdue, shoved into the kitchen drawer. I overheard phone calls my father hung up on quickly whenever I walked into the room. I saw his hands trembling each time he signed a check, as if every number written down was another knife's cut. One night, coming into the kitchen for a glass of water, I found him hunched over the table, his head buried in his hands, surrounded by a mountain of bills. I asked him what was happening, but he only shook his head, forcing a smile and muttering, "Just a small problem." His bloodshot eyes told me otherwise. The next morning, I called the bank directly. The voice on the other end was flat and cold as she read the number, $2,300 a month, and foreclosure proceedings would begin if another payment was missed. I bit my lips so hard I tasted blood. I could cover it if I cut back on everything, if I kept driving my old car, if I turned down the luxury trips my colleagues invited me on. I knew this was the price to keep my father from collapsing further, to preserve my mother's hollow pride. I signed up for automatic payments that very day, from my own account, and no one ever knew. And so, month after month, 3 years passed. Each time the money left my account, my heart clenched, but I told myself it was my duty. Looking back, the total climbed past $82,000, enough to buy my own condo, enough to lay the foundation for a future free of dependence. But instead of building my life, that money went to keeping upright a brick house where I had always been treated as an outsider. The house still stood, lights glowing, gardens manicured, but I knew what I was really preserving was not a home, it was the empty shell of pride my mother clung to with every breath. I had spent months searching for the right watch for my father. It wasn't just a birthday gift, it was my attempt to repay, even in some small way, the losses he had endured since losing his job. I remembered the day he quietly folded a magazine closed after lingering on an advertisement for a classic watch, smiling faintly as he said, "Beautiful, but it's just a dream." That day, I silently promised myself that one day I would make that dream real for him. And when he opened the box, his eyes lit up, his hand trembling as he traced the leather strap like he was afraid it might vanish if he touched it too hard. "Lauren. I can't believe you," his voice cracked, his shoulders, so heavy for so long, suddenly seemed lighter. In that moment, I saw again the father who once held my hand walking across the schoolyard, a man filled with hope and love. But the joy was short-lived. My mother sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, her eyes narrowed as if weighing my guilt. "Must be nice having all that money," she said, her voice sharp, hissing through her teeth, slicing the warm air of the room to pieces. She leaned toward me, her gaze cold and piercing. "While we're counting every penny for groceries, you throw away piles of money on something so frivolous? What exactly are you trying to prove?" The room froze. My father looked up, his lips twitching as though he might defend me, but as always, he only sighed, lowered his head, poured himself more wine, and let the silence shatter around us. The watch still rested in his hand, but now it looked like a piece of evidence against me, gleaming under the light as though it were accusing me of a crime I didn't even know I had committed. I forced a smile, but the corners of my mouth trembled, and my stomach twisted into knots. I knew well that no matter what I did, in my mother's eyes I was always wrong. I gave my father the gift he had longed for, and she called it wasteful. If I had given him nothing, she would have mocked me as thoughtless, ungrateful. There was no choice that allowed me to escape the trap she had built from her endless criticisms. My father sat there in silence, as if silence could cover everything. But it was that very silence that made me feel more alone than ever. I looked at him, wishing to see him take my side just once, but all I saw in return were his evasive eyes and his hand clenched so tightly around his glass that his knuckles turned white. And I realized I was exhausted, yet still clinging, still trying, because if I let go, I would become the unfilial child my mother had always branded me to be. My father sat with his eyes fixed on the glass of wine, letting my mother's words fall like hailstones. He had once been strong, the man who walked into boardrooms and closed big deals, but in front of my mother he shrank, a shadow of himself. I waited for him to speak up, just once, so I wouldn't have to stand alone, but all he offered was avoidance, as if silence could stitch together the rips tearing through the dinner. And that silence left me feeling suffocated in my isolation. That night, I drove back to my small apartment, my head spinning, my heart pounding wildly. I had every reason to stop, to cut the cord, but I kept driving back to their house each weekend, kept calling to check in, kept paying the mortgage as if that responsibility were tied to my very breath. I knew I was drained, my body weary, my mind frayed, my stomach knotting painfully every time I anticipated seeing my mother. But in my head, a familiar voice repeated, if I walked away, I would be the ungrateful child, the one who let her parents lose everything. At church, in the neighborhood, in the eyes of others, there was no greater shame. And so I trapped myself in that vicious cycle, depleted more each day but still holding on, terrified that if I let go, I would become exactly the label my mother had pressed on me, a failure, ungrateful, never enough. That evening, I went to their house unannounced. In my hand was a bag of Italian food my father liked, thinking maybe dinner would be lighter if no one had to cook. But as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. From the kitchen came my mother's voice, sharp as a blade, that girl thinks she's so great, little Miss Perfect, but all she does is make us feel ashamed. My heart dropped, and the bag of food grew so heavy it dragged my arm down. I heard my father's voice, low and tired, as if he were trying to smother the storm, Caroline, she's only trying to help. But my mother pressed on. We don't need her pity. She just wants to prove we're incompetent. Always flaunting, always acting superior. I backed away carefully, willing the wooden floor not to creak, then slipped out silently and sat in my car by the curb, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I sat there a long time, my chest heavy, torn between tears and the bitter awareness of my own foolish hope, that one day she might see something good in me. But as always, I swallowed it all, wiped my eyes, and pretended I had never heard those words. 2 weeks later, at my father's 60th birthday party, I promised myself this time would be different. This time I would speak, I would do something to change the cycle. I had spent months searching for the classic watch he once lingered over in a magazine before turning the page with a resigned smile, dismissing it as a distant dream. When he opened the box, his eyes lit up, his hands trembling as they brushed the leather strap, and in that moment he looked younger, revived. I sat there with a quiet swell of joy, believing I had finally given him something that made him truly happy. But that joy was cut off brutally. My mother folded her arms, her eyes flashing. So much money to spare, huh? While we're counting every penny for groceries, you throw piles of cash away on something useless like this? The air in the room sank heavy, everyone fell silent. My father opened his mouth as if to speak, but then poured himself another drink and retreated into silence, as always. I bit my lip hard, forcing down the lump rising in my throat. I was used to being criticized, but this time it felt like she had stripped away the very meaning of the love I was trying to give. After dinner, I gathered every ounce of courage and placed a stack of papers on the table. I had prepared it carefully, a financial plan to help them pay off debt, cut expenses, hold on to the house they were clinging to so desperately. I looked straight at them, my voice shaky but clear, I want to help. This is my work. I know we can restore balance. I thought it would be an outstretched hand, but instead my mother shot to her feet, her chair crashing back against the floor. There it is! This is what you've been waiting for, isn't it? To see us fail, so you can swoop in as the savior. You think you're better than us, smarter than us? You just want to humiliate your parents in front of everyone. Her voice hissed, each word slamming down like a blade. I turned to my father, searching for a word, a look of protection, but he only sat there, shoulders slumped. In that moment, I understood. All those years I had swallowed bitterness, fought exhaustion, clung on to avoid being branded the ungrateful child, they had led me straight into a dead end. And right there at that dinner table, everything finally exploded. I looked at my father one more time, clinging to the faintest hope that he would rise, put his hand on my shoulder, and tell my mother she had gone too far. But he only lowered his head, his shoulders collapsing inward like a man who had forgotten how to protect. In that instant I knew his silence was my answer, and it cut deeper than any insult ever could. The sobs broke out of me, uncontrollable, clogging my throat. For the last 3 years, do you even know what I've been doing? My voice trembled, but each word hit the table like a hammer. I've been paying the mortgage on this house. $2,300 every month. On time. For nearly $83,000 total, the kind of money I could have used to buy my own condo. I did it so you wouldn't lose this place. And now you tell me I only wanted to watch you fail? The room froze. The silence was so thick I could hear the pounding of my own heartbeat. My mother went rigid, her eyes wide, her lips parting as if she couldn't believe what she just heard. For a split second, I thought I saw the emptiness behind her eyes, the void she'd spent years covering with arrogance and cutting words. But it passed quickly, and the familiar fury surged back, fiercer than ever. She slammed her hand against the table, her face flushed red, shouting so loudly I saw my father's wineglass tremble. Get out of my house. And never come back. Those words tore apart whatever was left. They weren't just an order, they were a knife, severing everything I had clung to for decades. I stood frozen, tears burning down my face, turning to my father, hoping he would protest, hoping he would tell me I didn't have to leave, that I had already sacrificed too much. But he just sat there, eyes fixed on the table, his hand gripping his glass of wine so tightly his knuckles turned white, not a word, not a nod, not even a shake of the head. That bowed face was confirmation enough that I truly was alone. Inside me, something cracked. It felt as though I had been holding this house, holding them, keeping everything together with my own hands so it wouldn't collapse, and now they were the ones pushing me out, discarding me like a stranger. I didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't even search for a reason to hold on anymore. I simply turned quietly, knowing that from that moment forward, everything had changed, that the walls I had held up with my sweat and tears would never again be a home for me. I went upstairs and packed in silence. The small overnight bag I had brought was barely enough for a few sets of clothes and a jar of moisturizer, but my hands shook as though I were packing away my entire life. I walked down the stairs, no one saw me off, no one offered a hug, no one spoke a word to stop me. My father stood in the hallway, his head bowed, while my mother kept her back to the window, not bothering to look at me even once more. I gripped the doorknob tightly, drew in a deep breath, and pulled it open. There was no dramatic slam, only a soft click as it shut behind me, but to me the sound echoed like the snap of a cord that had been pulled taut for far too long. I drove into the night, the familiar road from their house back into the city emptier than I had ever seen it. Cold air rushed in through the crack in the window, brushing against my tear-streaked face, and I suddenly realized I was both crying and breathing more easily than I had in years. The pain was there, sharp and deep, but strangely, within it, I felt the faintest glimmer of lightness, a fragile sense of freedom, trembling but undeniable. For the first time in my life, I was no longer imprisoned within walls of silence, control, and endless comparisons. The very next morning, I sat at my computer, opened my bank account, and canceled the mortgage payments for good. Each click of the mouse was both terrifying and liberating. 3 years, $2,300 every month, nearly $83,000 gone, and now, it was over. I was no longer financially bound to that house, to that shell my mother had paraded as her triumph. I decided I would find a place of my own, somewhere no one had the power to throw me out. I began touring homes, at first only to reassure myself that I had options. But then, when I stepped into a two-bedroom condo inside a renovated Victorian house in the heart of Charlotte, I knew instantly this was where I belonged. Sunlight poured through the wide windows, the wooden floor creaked softly beneath my feet, and the air seemed to whisper, "This is yours." I signed the papers, put down the deposit with the money I had saved, money I had once funneled into preserving a house that never wanted me. Only this time, the roof was truly mine, and no one could ever take it away. I remember my first therapy session with Dr. Parker as if it were a door opening into a room I had never dared to enter. That room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking, golden light spilling across old shelves of books. I sat there, my hands gripping a glass of water, speaking and holding back tears. I told her about the years of being called inadequate, about the moment I overheard my mother muttering "Little Miss Perfect," about the times I gave gifts only to receive her bitter smirk in return. I told her about the 3 years I had automatic withdrawals from my account paying the mortgage on that house, like an invisible gatekeeper, keeping it from collapse. When I finally stopped, drained as if I had run a marathon, Dr. Parker sat quietly, nodded slowly, and said, "What you are describing is very typical. Your mother shows strong narcissistic traits. And your father, through his long silence, became the enabler. He didn't stop it, and his silence allowed it all to continue." I sat frozen, my heart tightening. Her words hurt as though someone had turned my entire life inside out, yet at the same time, they were a truth I had never dared to name. In the sessions that followed, I began to re-examine everything I had done. I realized that paying the mortgage in secret wasn't the act of rescue I told myself it was, but a form of enabling their denial. I had let them continue believing the illusion that everything was fine, that the house was sustained without them ever having to face reality. "There's a clear line," Dr. Parker said, her tone firm but gentle, "between helping and enabling. Helping is when you hand someone the tools so they can stand up on their own. Enabling is when you remain under them, holding them up again and again until you collapse yourself." Her words made me shudder, the images of those years of transfers and quiet sacrifice rising like a confession that I had allowed myself to be drained completely. I began to experiment with boundaries, something I had always thought existed only in books. I stopped calling my mother every day as if it were a ritual, stopped sending money every time my father hinted at hardship. The first time he left me a message saying, "If you can, send a little to help us get through this month," I let the phone ring out without picking up. I sat in my new condo, hands shaking, a wave of guilt rising like a tide that threatened to sweep me away. I asked myself if I was becoming the ungrateful, unfilial child my mother had always accused me of being. But when the night passed, I realized that for the first time, I slept until morning without waking in panic. Each week that went by, I felt myself breathing easier, my shoulders lighter. I understood that stopping the financial support, no longer rushing in like a firefighter every time their house went up in flames, didn't mean I was abandoning my family. It meant I was refusing to burn myself alive alongside them. I was not a bad daughter for protecting myself. I was simply beginning to exist as an independent human being, with clear boundaries, and with the belief that true love is not endless sacrifice to the point of self-destruction. I arrived at the cafe half an hour early, taking a corner table with a clear view of the door. I wanted the advantage of seeing my father approach, to steady myself before facing him. I had prepared a short list in my notebook, the things I would say, the boundaries I would not let slip. No promises, no taking on their burdens, no letting myself be cornered. I repeated it to myself like a mantra. When the cafe door opened, I saw my father walk in. But right behind him was my mother. She wore a gray coat, her hair pulled back, her face tense. My whole body went cold, as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water over me. I stared at my father, my hand trembling beneath the table, while he came closer, stammering, "I thought, it would be better if your mother were here too." In my mind I heard the coffee cup in front of me crack, my palms burning from how tightly I was gripping it. Everything I had prepared vanished in an instant. They sat down, my father across from me, my mother leaning slightly as if ready to leave at any moment. The air was heavy, and the clinking of spoons against cups from nearby tables felt piercing. My father broke the silence first. His voice was low, weary. "Lauren, I have to apologize. Not just for what happened at the birthday, but for the many years I stayed silent, letting you become the target of all the anger. I know I failed you. I looked at him, trying to accept the apology I had longed for my entire life, but it came so late it ached. I wanted to believe it, but inside me rose a sharp doubt. Would he truly change, or would he bow his head again, like always? Then my mother spoke. Her voice was different, not the sharp edge I had grown used to, but trembling, as if she were wrestling with herself. Your father showed me the bank statements, the mortgage payments. I didn't know. She stopped, eyes dropping, breathing deeply. I was jealous of you, Lauren. You had the career I gave up. I chose family, chose the house, and when I saw you succeed, instead of pride, I felt ashamed. I turned that regret into anger, and I took it out on you. I sat in silence. In that moment, I didn't see the powerful, cold woman etched in my memories, but an empty, lost person clinging to the past. I felt pain, but I no longer wanted to be the rescuer. My voice came out hoarse but firm. Whatever the reason, you destroyed me while calling it love. I cannot go back to the way things were. I will not keep being the punching bag, the wallet, the scapegoat. I saw her blink quickly, while my father reached out a hand toward me but stopped halfway, suspended in the air. The cafe seemed frozen. I knew this conversation wasn't about patching the past, it was about drawing the lines for a new present. And I sat there, my heart trembling but strong, for the first time not bowing before them. After that meeting, I stepped outside on unsteady legs, but inside me was a feeling I had never known. I had laid down a real boundary, a line I had never dared to draw before. The following days were heavy. The phone rang several times but I didn't answer right away. I learned to sit in silence, to let my heart grow used to not reacting instantly to every plea for rescue. And slowly, changes began to appear, hesitant, clumsy, but real. My father was the first to change. He found a position as a sales manager at a small company in Charlotte. The pay was only half of what he once earned, but for the first time in years I saw him smile as he talked about his work, saw real light in his eyes instead of the weary stare over the rim of a wine glass. On the phone he told me, I don't feel useless anymore. I stayed quiet, swallowing the lump in my throat, but inside, my heart warmed in a way I could hardly put into words. As for my mother, I'll admit, I never truly believed she could change. But then I heard she had taken a job as a receptionist at a real estate office. On her first day, she called me, her voice still tinged with pride. They had to admit I organized paperwork faster than the actual staff. I smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a smile without bitterness. A few months later, that same office offered to sponsor her to get her realtor's license. I didn't say much, only replied, if you want it, then do it. And in her voice, I heard a new kind of eagerness, not the hollow vanity I'd grown used to, but something alive, something genuine. And then there was the house. The 5-bedroom suburban mansion, the one soaked with all my painful memories, finally slipped out of their hands. They sold it, paid off the bank, and moved into a smaller townhouse in the city. The first time I visited, I found my mother sitting in the modest living room. There were no crystal chandeliers, no elaborate curtains, yet she looked peaceful. She said, fewer rooms, less to clean. I can breathe easier here. I stayed quiet, glancing around the new space, feeling a strange mix of sorrow, relief, and a small flicker of hope. Change didn't come like a miracle. It came because I had pulled back for good, because I had drawn the line and refused to erase it. My father rediscovered dignity in his new job. My mother reclaimed a piece of herself she had abandoned decades earlier. And I learned that sometimes love isn't about holding everything together in your own arms, it's about letting go, so others can carry their share, no matter how painful that may be. My father was the first to change, and I realized it through his voice more than his paycheck. One morning, he called me sounding lighter than he had in months. I've got a job now, at a small sales company. The pay's half of what I used to make, but at least I feel useful again. They respect my experience, and every morning I have a reason to get out of bed. I sat frozen, clutching the phone, my heart clenching tight. For years I had only seen him retreat behind a glass of wine, letting my mother dominate, letting me take the blows alone. And now, hearing him speak with a hint of pride, I felt tears rise. Not tears of pure happiness, but because it was a fragile light I thought had gone out forever. And my mother, the person I believed would never change, ended up surprising me in the strangest way. One afternoon, she called, her voice bright with excitement but shaded with shyness. "I've started working at the real estate office. Just as a receptionist, handling paperwork, but everyone says I'm efficient and quick." I gave a soft laugh into the silence, half doubtful, half astonished. Weeks later, she called again, her voice trembling with joy she couldn't hide. "Lauren, they want to sponsor me to get my realtor's license. They say I have a knack with clients, that people trust me." I bit my lip, overwhelmed by a surge of emotion. In her voice, there was no empty bragging, no cutting sarcasm, just a fragile, genuine confidence. A confidence she had buried for decades behind the role of the perfect housewife. The first time I visited their new townhouse, the scene took me by surprise. My father sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, morning light slipping through simple curtains, no crystal chandelier overhead, no long, cold dining table stretching the room. My mother stepped out from the living room holding a folder of client documents, her hair tied neatly back, her face tired but brighter than it had been in years. She looked at me, not with the scrutinizing gaze I had grown used to, but with a small nod, like a quiet greeting. I stood there, my heart caught between bitterness and relief. For years I had paid with my own exhaustion, hoping they would change, only to discover that it was only when I stopped, when I drew my boundaries, that they were finally forced to stand on their own. The new home was small, just 2 bedrooms and a cozy living room, but inside it I saw, for the first time, my parents as 2 people trying to live their own lives instead of clinging to hollow illusions. And I, for the first time, stepped inside without feeling judged, like a guest who had chosen to remain on the safe side of an old line, watching without being pulled back in. After the day they signed the papers to sell the suburban mansion, I felt as though an old chapter had closed. That house had been the symbol of my mother's control and my father's silence, a vast stage where I was only a faint supporting role, forever compared, criticized, pushed aside. Watching the moving trucks pull away with the furniture my mother once bragged about to neighbors, I sat still in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my hands went numb. I didn't go inside, didn't say goodbye. That house had never truly been a home to me, and seeing it leave their hands filled me with more relief than regret. Their townhouse in the city was far smaller, with only 2 bedrooms and a warm little living room. No more cavernous empty spaces, no more pressure to maintain a perfect image for the outside world. I remember that first step inside, my father at the dining table with dark circles under his eyes but a look of peace I had never seen in him before. My mother was sorting through client files on the table, her hair pulled into a bun, her hands busy but her expression strangely at ease. No velvet curtains, no expensive salon set, just a few simple pieces of furniture, and for the first time, I realized the truth in that simplicity. They were learning to live authentically. Our relationship slowly became less dramatic. Visits no longer erupted into shouting after only a few words, no longer carried public jabs or deliberate sighs. But I never forgot the years behind us, and I knew I needed to keep my distance to protect myself. I visited when I had the strength, no longer out of weekly obligation. I answered the phone when I wanted to, and let it ring out when I didn't. I drew a line for myself. I could listen, I could advise, but I would never again carry the weight for them. I would never again step into the role of the rescuer child, the one who sacrificed silently to hold together a family facade already cracked. When I left that townhouse, my steps felt lighter. I was still their daughter, but now I was also an independent person, with the right to say no, with the right to live without trading away my inner peace for scraps of acceptance. I loved my parents in the way I could, without destroying myself in the process. And in that careful distance, I realized that real love isn't letting yourself be drained by others, but holding on to enough of yourself to keep living and breathing. My 2-bedroom condo in downtown Charlotte is nothing compared to the 5-bedroom mansion my parents once clung to, but to me, it holds the value of an entirely new life. I painted the living room walls jade green, the very color my mother once mocked as tacky and forbade me to choose when I lived at home. I laid a thick wool rug across the wooden floor, placed a bookshelf by the wide window so I could sit and read the paper each morning in the sunlight. For the first time, every object in this home was chosen by me, without anyone's judgment, without anyone telling me what I should or shouldn't do. And most importantly, no one can throw me out of here. I adopted a golden-furred cat named Milo. He appeared in my life like a tiny companion, rushing to the door every time I came home, brushing against my legs with a soft meow. That simple feeling of being welcomed, of being wanted, even from a cat, warmed my heart more than all those cold family dinners I had endured. At night, Milo curled up beside me, a reminder that at last, I had a place that truly felt like home. My career, no longer drained by endless financial obligations and constant guilt, suddenly bloomed in ways I hadn't expected. I was assigned more important clients, then promoted to team leader. I found myself more creative in my work, more focused in strategy, and most importantly, I finally had the energy to enjoy the fruits of my own labor. I was no longer living in a state of choosing between my career and their survival. I could simply be myself, a woman working out of passion, fully aware of her own worth. My family changed too, though not overnight. My father found a new job, modest but steady, and I heard dignity return to his voice. My mother began working at the real estate office, slowly discovering real confidence instead of the shallow pride she once wore like armor. We spoke less often, saw each other less frequently, but when we did, there was less drama, less noise, fewer biting remarks. I kept my distance, the boundaries I needed to protect myself. I could listen, but I would no longer carry their burdens. I could care, but I would not sacrifice myself until nothing remained. Now, looking back on the road I've traveled, I understand something that seems simple, but took me a lifetime to absorb. Sometimes, true love isn't carrying everything for someone else, isn't sacrificing until you collapse. Sometimes, true love is stopping, letting others take responsibility for their own lives, letting them learn how to rise after their own falls. Because only when I let go did they finally grow. And only when I drew my boundaries could I love them without destroying myself. If my story makes you see yourself, at a tense dinner table, in the silence of a father who never speaks, or in the unending criticism of a mother, I want you to know you are not alone. Learning to set boundaries, to stop, to say enough, is often the hardest thing, but it may also be the only way to find yourself again. It took me years to realize that love doesn't mean carrying it all, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do for your family is to let them be responsible for their own lives. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your own experience about setting boundaries within your family. Write it down in the comments, because your story might be the light that guides someone else who is struggling in the dark, searching for a way out. And maybe today, by speaking up, you'll save a stranger who needed exactly this reminder to begin their own journey.